Good afternoon, and welcome to Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. I'm Michael Trick, and I'm the dean here. So today we are introducing a new distinguished lecture series at CMUQ, the inaugural Bill Brown Distinguished Lecture in the Biological Sciences. Distinguished lectures at CMUQ provide a glimpse into the depth and breadth of scholarship of the many experts who visit our campus. We have different types of distinguished lectures, each representing a field of expertise, and each type is named after a notable academic from Carnegie Mellon. The Distinguished Lecture in Biological Sciences is named in honor of Bill Brown, an honored professor of biological sciences at Carnegie Mellon who passed away in 2007. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to spend a few minutes honoring Bill Brown. We are fortunate today that we have Carnegie Mellon's Vice Provost for Education, Amy Burkert, here with us today. Amy met Bill Brown in 1982 when she was a PhD student and went on to work with him for decades in the Department of the Biological Sciences. I'd like to invite Amy to say a few words about Bill.
Thank you, Mike. It's certainly an honor to be present at the inaugural Bill Brown Distinguished Lecture. As Mike indicated, I had the privilege of working very closely with Bill for many years, and I know he would have been pleased by this recognition, but actually he would have been more pleased and more excited for the opportunity that this series is going to offer to bring distinguished speakers and important topics in biology to the whole CMUQ community. Bill was a talented researcher, an engaging teacher, an innovative educator, a successful entrepreneur, a skilled administrator, and a truly devoted member of the Carnegie Mellon community for nearly 4 decades. Bill embodied all that we value at Carnegie Mellon. He truly was an amazing colleague and a valued friend. Bill received his doctorate in biochemistry from the University of Minnesota in 1971 and completed his postdoctoral fellowship in biophysics at Yale University before he launched his faculty career at Carnegie Mellon in 1973. His pioneering work in protein biochemistry was known throughout the world, and he was involved in some of the fundamental efforts in cloning Taq polymerase, an important enzyme that had a transformative effect on the field of molecular biology. As a department head in biological sciences for many years, Bill set the standard for excellence in a holistic student experience, and he worked to advance and integrate the research and educational missions of the university. Bill was not only innovative and impactful in the laboratory, but also in the classroom and the scientific community. He was instrumental in the early years of Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative, and the OLI biology course that he worked to develop is still used by numerous individuals and countless institutions around the world. He also spearheaded a National Science Foundation project to infuse computational methods into high school biology curricula. In 2004, he received the university's highest distinction, the Doherty Award, in recognition of his sustained and substantial impact on education. There truly seem to be no limits or boundaries to Bill's willingness to continue to learn and work tirelessly to advance science and science education. In the spring of 2007, Bill and his wife, Linda, came to Qatar. They quickly became a part of the CMU community, and I vividly remember the energy and excitement Bill shared with me about CMUQ and the amazing potential he saw here. His enthusiasm for this work that was being done was truly inspiring. After Bill's sudden passing that summer, Chuck Thorpe, CMUQ's founding dean, stated in his remarks, Bill brought an infectious and unstoppable enthusiasm to the Qatar campus. He was passionate about teaching, excited about shaping junior faculty, and upbeat about the potential for doing really great things here in Doha. He made the Qatar campus a real part of Carnegie Mellon, rigorous, demanding, and at the same time exciting and fun. One of the ways that he worked to build community was through his love of biking, and I believe that his bike is still present in the building here as we speak. Bill was always looking beyond what was to what could and perhaps should be. He actually was among the first to realize and suggested to me even before I became vice provost the important role a biological sciences program could have here in Qatar. He taught a hybrid course across both campuses with me on diabetes, and that was really quite successful. Bill never saw limits, he only saw opportunities. And while he was not able to witness the founding and growing success of the CMU Biological Sciences program here in Qatar, it is so fitting for his vision and foundational efforts to bring biology to CMUQ to be recognized by the naming of this lecture series in his honor and memory. Thank you all for continuing to expand his impact and allowing his legacy to live on through all who will be taking part in this series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Ann Gibbons has been a correspondent for more than a decade for Science magazine, where she has specialized in writing about evolution. As part of her research, she has camped with anthropologists in Kenya, trailed a medical anthropologist studying the health effects of deforestation in Papua New Guinea, built phylogenetic trees on computers, and logged many, many hours in dark conference rooms absorbing PowerPoint slides. The result of this exploration has been hundreds of news stories and features on topics ranging from the evolution of viruses and DNA to the discovery of fossils of feathered dinosaurs and early human ancestors. Ms. Gibbons has taught science writing in the English department at Carnegie Mellon University and is the author of The First Human, The Race to Discover Our Earliest Ancestors, which I am reading right now, and I will tell you is a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. It is, it's like a mystery. It's fantastic. Anyways, and the LA Times also liked the book. It was a finalist for their Best Science and Technology book. Please join me in welcoming Ann Gibbons to the Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. Ann?
Thank you. See my timing. So let's hope this works. Can you hear me all right? Okay, it is my absolute pleasure to be here. It's really fitting that I'm also here for the Bill Brown lecture because I was on a committee passionately about teaching biology students to write well. And so that was a mission I shared with him. I was not a major player in that initiative, but his enthusiasm for communicating about biological sciences was tremendous and memorable. So I'm excited to be doing that. I also want to thank you for inviting me and for Gordon Rule as well. It's been a really wonderful thing for me to see this campus finally. I've heard about it for many years. It's really impressive. And the students are impressive. I've had fun interacting with them, especially in the science writing talk. I wanted to also thank Edna for all the logistics and also Afshan. I don't know where she is, but she has done tremendous work to get us here. So really thank you very much. My pleasure to be here. So today's topic is a really fun topic for me. I'm going to start with a personal story. So I just traveled to India with my husband, Bill Shirless, who some of you might know. And during that trip, I was a little worried that I wouldn't get a lot of chance to exercise. And so I was very careful about what I was eating. I didn't want to come back and gain weight at the end of the trip. I was told by Ram Kunduru, some of you may know, that he usually gained a lot of weight when he went back home to India because the food is so fantastic. So I was very concerned. I was very careful about what I ate. I didn't have too much dessert. Meanwhile, my husband, who's 6'2", I won't make him stand up, ate everything and anything, dessert every single time. He didn't exercise, I did. We got home, I gained a pound, he lost a pound. It's so unfair. And so I bring up that story because I have a very efficient phenotype, right? I'm small, I store fat well, I conserve calories well. It's an important part of my discussion. We're going to talk about the Western diet, the evolution of diet, and why some people have a much harder time on the Western diet than others. We're going to get to that. So this is going to be an evolutionary point of view. The evolution of diet. And some people have been wondering, are we Stone Age people living in a fast food world? I need to point here. Can I point at the screen? Here we go. So, in a world where we have obesity, diabetes, the metabolic syndrome, all on the rise, tremendous problems with this, people are asking, is this because we have a disconnect between our bodies? Have we not evolved fast enough to adapt to our modern diets? Is this what's going on? And some people have also asked, could eating like our ancestors make us healthier? In the United States, certainly there's a huge trend. Paleo diets are a big fad. So I'm going to talk about that. When people think of paleo diets, when they think of ancient diets that our ancestors eat, they think of a caveman diet like a Neanderthal eating a lot of meat. This is an Inuit Eskimo eating seal meat dipped in ketchup, her favorite way of doing it. This is an outdoor store. There's sort of freezer that shows a bit of killer whale there. You see the jaw of a killer whale, and you also see meat ribs of the killer whale and a flipper from a bearded seal. So this is what people think of when they think of what our ancestors ate often, a lot of meat. And that's what the paleo diet dwells on. But when we talk to anthropologists, and you don't need to get the details of this, this is a chart of our human ancestors, meet our human ancestors. When you talk to an anthropologist about the paleo diet, they say, which paleo diet? Which ancestor, right? Because if you look at 6 million years, 6 to 7 million years of human evolution, starting way on the left, that's the earliest, where you have a hominid, a little upright walking hominid with a skull the size of an ape in Chad, the country of Chad. That's where the earliest fossils are found. And then you have Ardipithecus ramidus in Ethiopia and some other fossils in Kenya. You have many different types of human ancestors, and they lived in all different kinds of habitats and ate different kinds of foods. So which one? Whose diet is important for modeling what our ancestors ate? And I'm going to walk you through in this talk a little bit about human evolution, who are our ancestors, what kinds of things they ate, and then we're going to go to current diets. So here we have, this is our earliest ancestors, Ardipithecus ramidus, 4.4 million years old. And that's Sahelanthropus chadensis, tumai from Chad. You wouldn't invite them to dinner. They don't look like us, right? These guys were eating and living a lot like chimpanzees, living in the trees, living in the forest. So our ancestral primate diets, chimpanzees are probably the best model. Our ancestors were not chimpanzees. They were a relative of them that lived in Africa 6 to 7 million years ago, spent all their time in the trees, sleeping in nests in the trees. They spent all their time gathering fruits and vegetables, not vegetables, plant matter. Most of the day, they could spend, if they're like chimps, as much as an hour hunting, because if they took more than an hour hunting, the odds of catching something are so low, it's just too dangerous to spend the time hunting. So they really need to keep themselves fueled and alive. They need to spend most of their day grazing. And that's what our ancestors did initially. But around the beginning of the hominids, the human family, the ancestors that split off from the branch leading to chimpanzees and gorillas, they began walking upright, even though they still had small brains. And that is thought of as probably an adaptation to walking upright, to finding other food, maybe to be carrying it back to your mate because you had free hands walking upright. We're not really sure why that happened. That's the first thing that set us apart from other apes and other primates. So those are the early diets. Then our genus Homo, which arose in Africa about 2.5 million years ago. Everything's in Africa at this point still. Includes a famous ancestor, Homo erectus, up in the upper left. Lived about 1.8 million years ago. This is the first ancestor that starts to get a bigger brain, okay? And this comes along after the invention of stone tools. This is the first one that's eating more meat, butchering more meat, beginning to hunt. Not big game, they're competing with carnivores, but probably scavenging, probably eating smaller animals. Not eating a lot of meat, okay? This is still not a lot of meat. Even Neanderthals, who arose in Europe about 500,000 years ago. The earliest fossils are for 400,000 years. So we go from 1.8 million, 2 million, to 500,000 years ago in Europe. They're our cousins. They're not our ancestors. They were hunting, but they were also eating a lot of plants too. So even Neanderthals, thought of as the quintessential meat eater, they were actually making barley porridge. So they were eating complex carbs, okay? This is not just a meat diet that we're finding. Then our species arose in Africa. we're thinking now got pushed back to about 300,000 years. There's a fossil, this doesn't have a pointer on it, I don't think, but up in the upper left, Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, has features in its face that begin to look like it's becoming Homo sapiens, our species, okay? But there are other things in Africa over the last 500,000 years that also show features that look like Homo sapiens was evolving in Africa with connections between different populations. So we're not exactly sure where Homo sapiens arose. But we do know that Homo sapiens, early Homo sapiens, maybe some other ancestors, the ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo erectus, got out of Africa 1.8 million years ago. Some of the early Homo sapiens also made it to the Arabian Peninsula. Their dates as early stone tools, 300,000 years ago or so. So this was when the Arabian Peninsula was green. You may know about it, much wetter, greener, and early hominins, early human ancestors were coming in and out. Doesn't mean they were the direct ancestors of people living here today, because there's lots of movement. But there have been people living off and on the Arabian Peninsula for at least 300 to 400,000 years. And certainly 10,000 years ago, we see quite a bit of culture here. So the other thing that's important is these are the first members of Homo sapiens that look like us. 160,000 years, we have skulls from Ethiopia. They look just like us, but they weren't acting just like us. Okay, they were acting quite differently. The other part, the big revolution that happens in human evolution around this time is when did we begin cooking? So if Homo erectus around 2 million years was beginning to develop a bigger brain, this required a higher quality diet. This brain here requires a huge amount of energy. It's expensive tissue. It's glucose needs to fuel it, and you need a much higher quality diet. You can't spend your entire day picking plants and fruits and vegetables. You need to have some high protein and ideally cooking. When you cook food, this is Richard Wrangham's hypothesis at Harvard, when you cook food, you pre-digest it and you get the calories out of it more easily. Same with blending food. When you make smoothies or juices, you get the calories more rapidly. It's a very efficient way to get calories quickly. And so cooking, there's a debate about when it began. Richard Wrangham thinks it started with Homo erectus at 1.8 million. Other researchers say no, there's a second big increase in brain size in our fossil ancestors around 600,000 years ago. They think that's when cooking started. And they're looking for evidence of hearths and fire in the fossil record, which go back about 800,000. So cooking meant we were much more efficient in getting the calories out of our food. We began to have division of labor at that time, because while you have some people hunting, you have others who are cooking. So we began to change. Our behaviors impacted that, which is very interesting. So with Homo sapiens, we have by then cooking, a diet where they're getting their calories efficiently. They have a big brain as big as ours, as do Neanderthals. Their brain's bigger than ours. They came out of Africa in the last, so Homo sapiens, early archaic Homo sapiens and other species were out of Africa. But the ancestors of everybody outside of Africa date back to one migration, probably in the last 60,000 years or so. We know this from genetics. When you look at the DNA of all people living outside of Africa, we are remarkably closely related. If you take two chimpanzees from two subgroups in Africa, they have more genetic diversity than an Inuit or an Aleut Eskimo and somebody in Papua New Guinea or Europe. We have very little genetic diversity. But the genetic diversity we do have is all about, as we moved out of Africa and into all these different habitats, is about adapting to different habitats, different terrain, different climates. Cold adaptation requires different things, disease and diet, okay? So those are the main adaptations. And here we have ancient DNA, just to back this up. We have ancient DNA from ancient hominids, so we can begin to look at how are they different from us. We have ancient DNA from ancient Homo sapiens, from ancient Neanderthals, and from another kind of species called a Denisovan that lived in Siberia till recently. And when you look at the genetics of these people and you look at adaptations over time in different populations, you begin to see adaptations to different habitats like skin color. Okay, most of you probably know that white skin is a more recent development than dark skin. White skin allows you to absorb more ultraviolet radiation so that you can synthesize vitamin D in your skin and you're less likely to get rickets. Your bones are stronger. That wasn't necessary in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, in sub-Saharan Africa, you had enough sun that you didn't need that. So there were different balances with skin color. Genes to digest sugars in milk, lactose. That gene seems to have spread with herders at the beginning of pastoralism about 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. Herders from the Ural steppes in Russia brought it into Europe. It evolved, there are different versions of it though. It didn't just arise once. The ability to get sugars out of milk means you get more calories rapidly. That leads to more children in closer succession. That gene spread rapidly. So the way natural selection works is it picks traits that are advantageous in particular environments. It doesn't mean that lactose tolerance is good in every environment, or that white skin is good in every environment, or dark skin in every environment. But if that gene helps you in a particular environment, it can get selected for and spread rapidly through a population. So natural selection cares about what gives you more babies that survive. Not longevity, okay? Not living longer. It cares about whose babies survive, who has more babies rapidly. And that's how the genes spread. So one way to think about ancient diet is to look at there are two ways you can sort of reconstruct what our ancestors ate if you want to try to get clues about what might be good for us over time. One is you go to the fossil record and you look at isotopes in the preserved food. You reconstruct it. The reason we know that Neanderthals ate barley is we found barley associated with them and some residues on their tooth enamel, which is very interesting. So we know they were ingesting it. That's one way, but it's hard to get a complete picture of everything they ate. The other way is to look at traditional people living around the world today. What are they eating in different places? Now, these are not ancient people. This is the Hadza in Tanzania. They're among the last of the people who are only hunting and gathering to live. They're not using agriculture or farming or foraging. They're still hunting and gathering. There are only a couple hundred left. I was there with my family, traveling with them a year ago, and they're down to a very small number who can still keep their ancient lifestyle. They've evolved just like the rest of us. I want to make that perfectly clear. They're Homo sapiens, but they are eating in a way that is similar to our ancestors in Africa, we think. Anthropologists think that. And what can we learn from them? If you look at the man, he's a hunter. They make their spears. The woman has a stick with a knife at the end for digging out tuberous root vegetables out of the ground. And there's a bush baby they killed. The men are hunting. This is in Tanzania in the absolutely beautiful Iasi Valley. Here's the deal with hunting, though, and I have now traveled with traditional people. I did an assignment for National Geographic a few years ago, and these photos, by the way, are by Matthew Paley, whose name should show up on the next one at least, who traveled all over the world. We decided to look at what traditional people were eating all over the world to show the diversity of diets. This was the point. We wanted to show the range of things people would eat. And what we found every time we went places, and I didn't just find this, anthropologists have, is when guys go out to hunt, they often come back empty-handed. It's really hard to get much meat when you go hunt. It's very hard to bring a lot of meat back, even with guns. Okay? You will see one group I was with that had guns. Fishing is even hard. It's hard to catch enough food to feed your family. So what ends up happening is you rely on the women and children who dig all these starchy vegetables, the tuberous root vegetables, which provide most of your plant matter provides what percent? Let me just get that for you. It provides 69% of the calories that the Hadza eat, okay? So the backup food is the plant matter, and this is true in every culture. The Hadza also do something interesting, honey. Lots of honey. We think of sugar in our diet as really rare, but honey is big in their diet. This isn't true of every group of hunter-gatherers, but this is interesting, and they have bad teeth to show for it. These guys have co-evolved with a bird called the honey guide. It's the most amazing thing. When they find they find the honey guides, they will signal to them, the birds, where the honey is. And then they'll go in and smoke out the bees, gather the honey, and feed the birds the honeycomb. And so the birds know this. So it's like this coevolution over a long period where the birds work with the people, which is just truly amazing adaptation. And the Hadza, we actually had some of this honey. It was quite amazing. They found it for us. And these guys are incredible tree climbers, too. So that's the Hadza adaptation. But then you go up to Greenland, to the Inuit. And Matthew Paley went up there, and he had to go in, and he could only get in on boats certain days. And he was in with this village. This is the village of, let me get the Isertalk. Not all our ancestors ate like the Hadza. So we've already talked about the fact that they eat a lot of meat. That's a killer whale fin. They eat a high-protein, high-fat diet. But interestingly, they don't get much heart disease until recently with Western diet. They have such a high diet of omega-3s, they produce much less of it themselves, it turns out. They have genes that seem to play a role. This is a new discovery in the last couple of years. Rasmus Nielsen at Berkeley looked at the DNA, the sequenced it, and found they have genes that play a role in lowering the levels of LDL cholesterol. That's the type you don't want a lot of. So only about 3% of Europeans and 15% of Chinese, who they compared them with, have the same genes, which is very interesting. So this helps them survive in the brutal cold on a diet of seal blubber, okay? Lots of seal blubber, lots of fat. The only vegetables they get in the winter are those in the stomachs of seals, what's been fermenting in there. But they don't seem to get heart disease when they eat their traditional diet, and they are super active, okay? That's the other really important component, when they maintain the activity. The Chimani. I went and spent time, I camped with the Chimani in Bolivia, in the Amazon of Bolivia. These are not hunter-gatherers strictly. They mostly hunt and gather, but they also forage and grow a few crops like cassava. They have a few fruits and vegetables. This guy is an interesting guy, Jose Meyer Cune, 78. We found him. He's lean and healthy at 78. He has an active life. He grows golden papayas, mangoes, green plantains, grapefruit, corn, eats an occasional armadillo. The children, when we wandered around the forest with them, they were amazing. They knew all the plants they could eat. They would just snack off the plants. They didn't carry water bottles. They would take a leaf that had water in it and sip it, right? It's quite amazing to watch. They knew everything to eat. But the men went out every day when I was there, and it took a week before they came back with any meat. This is with guns, okay? Begins to tell you they're not eating meat every day, okay? They're very healthy when they eat their traditional diet, but while it has some meat, it's not every day. And they're eating a lot of vegetables, and they snack on the plants and a lot of fruit, and they put a banana on the coals for breakfast. Cassava, they make a cassava paste. Here are the sea gypsies of the Baja of Malaysia. So what should be becoming apparent to all of you is all the different places people had to figure out what to eat. They live literally just on the water. Her face is dusted in bedak sujuk, which is a cooling powder made of rice and pandan leaves, an interesting kind of sunblock. She's a teen. They live in these handmade houseboats and houses over the water. All their food comes from the sea, with the exception of a dish of ground cassava. And that's octopus, and that is at fried abalone, where that child's sleeping. Here's Afghanistan, the Kyrgyz of the Pamir Mountains of northern Afghanistan. These are yak and goat herders, okay? With the agricultural revolution, we began to see using, this girl, by the way, it's interesting, she's wearing the red veil of an unmarried girl. That'll change when she grows up. She's milking the family's yaks, and the milk curd will be dried for use in the winter when the yaks give less. Here, Michel Matupele, for my same story, went to, it's great to work with National Geographic because the art is so incredible, and he's let me use the slides. The herders in the Shimshai Pamir, it's a remote part of northern Pakistan near China, and this woman is straining the milk with her hand, removing the yak hair. The herders fatten their yaks, goats, and sheep in the summer pastures so they provide food in winter. So the animals are their storage system, right? So you have calories in the winter. So what this should show you is tremendous diversity of diets. These are plates he took photos of from all around the world. If traditional people today are eating so many different types of diets, it underscores that our ancestors also ate diverse diets. We evolved to eat anything and everything. The problem for our ancestors until about 100 years ago is most people didn't get enough food. So they struggled to get enough calories. This was the challenge and why we are so good at consuming calories today. They had fallback foods, too. They would have periods of scarcity in their diet, but not famine. Famine doesn't come till agriculture, and I'll talk about that in a minute. With a scarce diet, this is what the Hats eat, these berries and honey. The Kung of the Kalahari Desert of South Africa will traditionally rely on tubers and kojnono nuts, little nuts they get from trees. The Aka and Baka pygmies of Cameroon and Central Africa rely on yams. The Chimani, who you saw in the Amazon and the Yanomami, rely on plantains, bananas, and manioc. The Asmat of Papua New Guinea have a starchy pith of a wild sago palm. And Australian Aboriginals eat nutgrass and water chestnuts. Often they want a starchy food that gives them calories fast. Carbohydrates, pure sugars quickly. In times of scarcity, they might have a rough time. They might have periods where they're fasting, because, well, they're not fasting, where they're not getting enough food. But seasons change, food changes, and they migrated. They're all nomads, right? So they might have a tough period. That's part of how our biology evolved, but then they can move on to a new place and get food. Then came agriculture, though, and everything changed. 10,000 years ago, agriculture was invented in the Fertile Crescent and very rapidly in Asia after that, and at least in the Americas as well. It wasn't just a Fertile Crescent development. With farming, humans began processing more grains, making flour, and eating porridges, and less diverse diets. They were eating soft food. That changed our jaws. We just published a paper in Science a week ago, which some of you might have seen. When our jaws change, when you eat a hard diet, everybody's born with a bit of an overbite. As a child, you have a bit of an overbite, like this, front teeth over. With a hard diet of tubers like the Hadza, what happens is the lower jaw gets more robust, the teeth get ground down, and they end up being edge to edge, like this. So you chew your food like that. When you do that, it's harder to make certain sounds. So we think with modern humans, this affected language, not modern humans, with agriculture, soft foods. We end up with a slight overbite, and you can make labiodentals, which are sounds like F, F, and V. And those letters are not in any hunter-gatherers' diets. This is a new paper that just came out. They're only in the diets of people that have had agriculture at some time in their past, which is very interesting to think that biology and diet can change anatomy and language. Isn't that interesting? It's all intertied. So, but with agriculture also came more sedentary living. Okay, people began living with their animals, and this was when we think the origins of the flu, because the animals are incubating, you're sleeping with your pigs and your chickens and everything else, and you end up with viruses that adapt. You end up with flus, you're sedentary, you're not as healthy, and you eat a less diverse diet than hunter-gatherers who are collecting a lot of different nuts and seeds off from the environment. These women in Ethiopia, I visited the village of of Herto. That's where we saw the earliest fossils, 160,000 years old, of Homo sapiens. These are the people who live there today. They're from the Afar of the Middle Awash of Ethiopia. These women are grinding teff into, they have a flour making a bit of a porridge. The thing that's different, though, is they're working really hard. They're not just opening a bag of bread, right? They're burning a lot of calories preparing their food. This is what's important. This woman is making a flatbread. I thought it was so interesting, these young women in coals, right? So there's a lot of labor that goes into this, even though it's an agricultural diet. Then the next huge development in our evolution of diet after agriculture, which changed everything in a significant way, was, of course, processed foods and sugar. This is a sugar plantation in Puerto Rico. This drove slave trade. It's so fascinating to see the increase in sugar over time. Do you see this chart? I love it. Very low, around the 19th century, middle 1800s, it just took off, okay? This is in sugar consumption in the US, okay? I'm sorry I don't have worldwide, but this is what I could find. Look at the dips in World War I and World War II. There was less sugar produced. Isn't that interesting? But it also tracks diabetes. With the rise of sugars, we get diabetes, okay? We don't just get diabetes, we also get heart disease, we also get certain cancers associated with the Western diet and the rise of this, but diabetes is the most visible. And now what has happened, okay, when I talk about sugar, I'm not just talking about sugar, I'm talking about refined carbohydrates. That's white flours, white bread, white rice, okay? You may hear all the time that you should be eating complex carbohydrates if you eat them, and the reason that is because when you eat a packet a fruit or a brown rice or a whole grain, it takes longer to digest. You're not getting that spike in glucose as rapidly in your bloodstream, and it doesn't stress your pancreas as much, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So globally, about 1 in 11 adults have diabetes. 90% have type 2 diabetes. India and Asia are the epicenters now, okay? Diabetes is a disease, for those who don't really know it, in which your blood glucose or blood sugar levels are too high. Glucose comes from the foods you eat. Insulin, created by your pancreas, is a hormone that helps keep the glucose, gets them into your cells. It digests them, basically, to give you energy. With type 2 diabetes, the more common type, your body does not make or use insulin well. Without enough insulin, the glucose stays in your blood, okay? That's basically the problem. And the problem with that is you end up with all sorts of issues. It stresses your home, it can stress your organs, it can lead to all sorts of health problems. The major driving factors of the global diabetes epidemic include overweight and obesity, sedentary lifestyle, and increased consumption of unhealthy diets containing high levels of red meat and processed meat, refined grains, and sugar-sweetened beverages. But why are some places harder hit than others? The Yucatan Peninsula. It's called the nutrition transition. And people see, anthropologists I've talked to who study the evolution of diet, see that as you introduce refrigeration and little markets, whether it's in the Amazon and boats going up the river, or whether it's in the Yucatan, more sugar, you immediately begin to see first the women and the children, because they're a little less active, end up gaining weight and developing diabetes and other problems. Then the men, who often are the last to have the active lifestyle. In the Yucatan, they noticed in villages that were poorer, where people couldn't afford to buy soft drinks, their health is better. It's a recent result. The wealthier towns had more trouble. Soft drinks are, of course, the fastest way to get a high spike of glucose into your system. This is a fascinating story of what has happened with the Mayans and in the Yucatan. So diabetes was virtually unknown in Native Americans, so including those in Mexico and Central America and North America until the 1950s, virtually unknown. Half of Native Americans inherited a gene associated with diabetes, though. What's very interesting is this gene, called SLC16A11, is thought to cause an alteration in how you metabolize or digest fats, okay? They're very efficient at storing fats. And it may explain as much as 1/4 of the increase of diabetes in these populations. So they have a genetic predisposition that makes it harder for them to digest fats, possibly sugars as well. And that gene, interestingly, was introduced from interbreeding with Neanderthals. It was something that we have a lot of genes, a lot of us have, especially outside of Africa, Africans don't have this, have genes we got from Neanderthals. One causes blood clotting, which was probably great when you lived a hard life where you're working with stone tools, you wanted to clot. Now, though, in our environment, you don't want your blood to clot so rapidly. It gives you heart disease. This gene is increasing their chance of getting diabetes. The other reason is this, the thrifty phenotype hypothesis. And that is basically the idea. This was introduced about 25 years ago. These two guys, Barker and Hills, proposed that fetal programming, what happens in the development of fetuses, could represent an important player in the origin of diabetes, the metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. This is the idea that people who have restricted calories adapt to survival on lower calorie diets and are shorter and more efficient at using the calories. There is signaling to the mother. When the mother's pregnant, she's relaying signals to the infant about the environment the baby's going into. If it's low calorie, that information is getting to the growing baby, and it's going to grow up to be smaller. And that means all of its organs are smaller. So a baby that is a smaller birth weight baby has a smaller pancreas, which can't handle glucose overload as well, okay? So the worst thing you can do is give a low birth weight baby a high calorie diet or formula, lots of formula. Better to breastfeed it, better to watch the calories, watch the foods going in. What's happening in India? 70% of the population 100 years ago were in one part of India, in southern India, had famine. This is remembered from generation to generation, the smaller size. It takes a while to overcome these effects. After the World War II, the Dutch famine was famous. The children that were born at that time and their offspring continue to have issues with diabetes and other diseases. So there's memory. If you've been in a really hard environment, had to really work hard for your calories, it's reflected in the children that are born for generations. And the worst thing you can do is give them the Western diet, which is, if I haven't defined it, I think most of you probably know, high in fat, sugar, and salt, okay? And lots of meat. So this is part of the reason why in places like India and China, we're having such a tough response. I think there's some thinking, and it hasn't been proven, if you've had ancestors that have been eating an agricultural grain-based diet for a long time, there's been more time to adapt to that. It doesn't mean it's good for you either, but if your ancestors have been eating those foods, the babies that couldn't tolerate it died a long time ago. But with this sudden nutrition transition where you're rapidly introducing these foods and way too many calories, and then they're abandoning their active lifestyle and becoming sedentary, it's a perfect storm. It's just too many things going wrong, and we see it all over the world, from Evenki reindeer herders who abandoned their traditional lifestyle up in Siberia when the USSR dissolved. They're now having heart disease, cardiovascular problems. What is interesting is different populations respond differently. Some have more diabetes, some have more heart disease. It depends on your particular genetics and the way you adapt. So what to do, okay? Most researchers, well, first before I say that, This is some writing from, there's a guy, Bill Leonard at Northwestern, who has studied traditional populations like the Evenki and the Chimani, and he does brilliant work on the evolution of diet. And he said, a hallmark of human evolution has been our ability to increase the efficiency with which we extract food from our environments, okay? Think about first hunting, then cooking, then agriculture, then processed foods. Humans show remarkable diversity in their dietary regimes. In reality, what makes us human is our ability to find a meal in virtually any environment. Throughout most of our past, human lifestyles were characterized by high levels of physical activity and frequent periods of marginal or negative energy balance. In other words, not quite starvation, but low calories for periods when you couldn't find food with climate changes or whatever. These conditions selected for improvements in the energetic efficiency of human foraging strategies. So think about what I said at the beginning. As a woman, it makes sense that I can store fat well if I'm going to be pregnant or nursing a baby. Human babies have much bigger brains. And in the first year of life, their brains double in size. I need to be good at having stores of fat, right? Hence, part of the difference between my husband and me. We're evolving towards shorter size, which is very interesting. You think it's taller. It's actually, the trends from different genetic studies show a little bit shorter. It's an efficient adaptation. So today, we are in many respects victims of our own evolutionary success, if you think about it. Human populations of the industrialized world live in obesogenic environments with low levels of energy expenditure and abundant food supplies, contributing to strongly positive energy balances and growing rates of obesity and chronic metabolic disorders. And the hardest hit are those who've adapted best to variable calories, low-calorie diets. It's a great survival strategy until you hit the Western diet. So what to do? I'm wrapping up here. We often hear about the Mediterranean diet. What are the keys to a Mediterranean diet? Lots of fish, fruit, vegetables, plants, growing your own local foods. I had another slide, which I think I took out. Yeah, I had another slide that showed them eating together. Making food be about a social. If you look at societies that live long and do well, they eat together. And they sort of seem to have mechanisms to stop before they eat too much. And they're active. So here, what do you eat? Not the fast food. You can make these choices, obviously. I'm just trying to show some traditional foods that are safer to eat. I think there's something, a bread called regag, which seems to have whole wheat in it. I'm probably not pronouncing it right. Kusamasi, harissa, hummus, beans, lentils, whole grains, fruit, vegetables. Eat what your grandparents ate when they were active. The traditional foods are often better than the processed foods. Cook your own food. You don't have to go, grind your own flour, although I think you do. Come on. And I'm tempted to, actually. But eat what your grandparents ate. Stay active. I don't think it's all that complicated. We make food super complicated. We demonize certain foods. Okay, that might be right for sugar. Sugar's problematic in high doses. It has to be kept to very low doses, I think. Way too much in our diet. The jury's out on what fats are good, what fats aren't good. I think it's all moderation and an active lifestyle. And then also remember that when we look to the past, they all died young. The paleo diets were about who had the most babies. So we can look to clues to the past for what our ancestors ate, and they're probably wonderful clues about what's healthy for us. But take it with a big grain of salt. It was about reproduction. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I don't know. Yeah, we've got a little bit of time left. Thank you. Yeah.
So we do have some time for questions. You'd like to?
Yeah.
Just as a general question, do you get a lot of pushback when you lecture on these topics, especially when you are dealing with human genetics? At least in academia, that can be a very big touchy point.
So you mean ethnic differences in genetics? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm thinking in terms of, white supremacists, for example, are fond of going on YouTube videos and drinking, gallons of milk as kind of a symbol of their superiority.
So here's something that I love doing. My favorite project of the last couple of years, and I'm proud to say it just won a National Academy of Sciences Prize, their best science writing report last year. We did a special package on migrations in science. And what I did is the current genetics are showing, how do you make a European? We're all mixed up. We're all the product of many, many migrations. And just as a brief example, because we know Europe the best, but it's true all over the world, there are no purebloods. Europeans are a mix of hunter-gatherers that got to Europe. Hunter-gatherers have been in Europe for 50,000 years, modern human hunter-gatherers. Neanderthals were there earlier. but a lot of them pulled out or died off during the glacial period. So we see around 19,000 years ago that our ancestors were in Europe. The people living today date back about 19,000 years ago in Europe. They were hunter-gatherers that lived there, who originally came from Eurasia, right? Africa first, then Europe and Asia, then Asia, back in probably the Middle East, mostly from the Middle East. Then around 10,000 years ago, Anatolian farmers from what's now Turkey, that whole area, came in. Huge component of all Europeans, from Ireland to Germany to Scandinavia. Then a wave of these pastoralists, these guys I talked about, who brought the lactose tolerance gene in 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. They came with ox carts. Tall guys from the Ural steppes came in, and they started interbreeding with the farmers' daughters. Pretty soon they were out reproducing all the farmer males, and their Y chromosome spread. I have that Y chromosome today. A lot of us do, all over Europe, from Southern Europe all the way through. And then you had more waves of people from the Middle East. But the three major components, a lot of Middle East, right? So when we talk about pure roots, it's hilarious because there is no such thing as a Celtic biology, for example. Celtic was the word that the Greeks used for the other people. It's a culture. It's not a biology. It's not genetic. So we are really mixed. We're all nomads at heart. We're all migrants. And we showed this for all over the world. Who were the Philistines who came into the Middle East? They were a mixture of many cultures that were in boats. Same with Africa, constant migrations. This area, I couldn't find genetic studies of Qataris, and I really want them, but they're not here yet. India is getting a lot of really interesting studies at the moment, and Asia, but we're a little bit lagging because people always start with a European bias, right, in the genetics. So the white supremacists are misinterpreting the results. That's the problem. They're taking what they want from it, and it's maddening. It's maddening because that's not what the genetics are showing. We are not our genetics, we're many other things. Differences in culture matter. Ethnic identity matters. I'm not discounting that, but I think it is important to know that biologically, we're one species, remarkably alike genetically. The adaptations are about different habitats. You know, it's great to be tall if you're a tall Maasai warrior because it helps you thermoregulate in the hot sun. But if you're Inuit, you want to be short because it helps you be efficient in the cold. These are adaptations. That doesn't mean one is right or better. It's just what works in an environment. So that, I think the message of science is really powerful. I think it should unite us. But you know, like with everything about evolution that I write about, it can be taken out of context and used to divide people. And that's unfortunate. Yeah, you've got to.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for the talk. So something you said about the science and how powerful it is. So I'm making the similarities here between, so nowadays for cancer treatment, we sequence the genome, we figure out the difference in that person, and we give them treatment accordingly. Can we do something similar with diet? Like, can I go figure out what's the best diet for me? I need to figure out what my genetic is and figure out that based on my genetics, that's the diet I should eat.
So this is what's being predicted, right? Personalized genomes, and a lot of you know about personalized medicine. I don't know how well it's going to work because the problem is with so much of it, it's not like there's one gene for, lactose tolerance is unusual that there are genes that you can find the variants. The problem is like height. There are hundreds of genes that contribute to height. It's about gene regulation. So, they hoped when they first sequenced the human genome that there would be really obvious genes that helped us understand differences in cancer or diet or things like that. Turns out it's everything that is different that leads to disease or anything else is about regulation of many different genes and differences in how you finally regulate and fine-tune. And in fact, that's what's interesting about the Neanderthal genome. We're studying the Neanderthal DNA today, what it's doing in those of us. I have about 2.9, well, I don't have that much. 23andMe is a service where you send off your DNA, you spit into something, and they get your markers across your genome. I have, according to them, 2.9% Neanderthal DNA, which is more than my husband's, and I've been lording it over him. But it's probably lower than that. It's probably 1 to 3%, depending on who you are. But what those genes are doing today in us is very interesting because it means when we moved into Europe, we picked up genes from them quickly that helped us adapt to diseases and diet and habitat. Rather than spending thousands of years evolving, we were able to grab genes by interbreeding. So that's interesting. There are a few genes that are really obvious things like blood clotting, but mostly it's all subtle differences in regulating different things. So I think there's a lot of excitement and hope about personalized medicine and being able to have your DNA sequence to say, oh, you can't tolerate this or that. By the way, gluten, a lot more people think they can't tolerate gluten than can't. I think there's sensitivity, but I think a lot more people can process gluten than think can't. So, people want to demonize something, and it's interesting. It'll be interesting to actually get the genetics and see if we can figure that out. We're not there yet. Cancer is interesting because we're no longer defining so much by organ, right? We're looking at the similarities on the cell markers to look at what treatments you might see, a treatment for colon cancer, working for a breast cancer. There are many different types of cancers. And we have this ancient system of saying, oh, it's all breast cancer, all colon cancer. And while there might be similarities, they're often not. So you had a question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really
Sure.
interesting.
Thanks.
I was wondering, since it seems like many of the societies that you looked at have not
I'm sorry,
actually...
could you press the microphone?
Yeah.
Is that on? Oh, yeah. Many of the societies you looked at, they have not eaten that much meat, actually. So is there a genetic argument for plant-based diets, or is there a reason to eat meat? I'm sure you get that question a
So
lot.
there is really interesting data coming out. There are a couple studies. There's a guy, Ajit Varki at UC Santa Cruz, who studies sialic acids. Okay, these are receptors on the outside of your cells that are different in humans than in chimpanzees. And he thinks that we have, as a result, when we try to eat other meat, we have an immune response. We end up with an inflammatory response. He's a vegan now. He will not eat any meat as a basis of that. There could be something to that. I don't know. Until you do trials, how do you know? There's other work that shows burning food is not good for you. There's other work that show, there's all sorts of work about how meat stays in your colon longer. It's better to have plants and fiber because it moves things through more rapidly. You have, there's just correlations, less colon cancer. So meat in moderation, right? I mean, probably less red meat. All nutritionists will tell you this. I'm not a nutritionist, but all the diets that I read, they're healthy diets, say less meat. There's probably a lot of good in eating a vegetarian diet. A raw diet you can't survive on. You can't survive on as a human. We needed cooked food to be able to feed this brain. People who live on raw diets now are supplementing with protein or other things. That's the only way they can get through with that. That's kind of extreme. What else did you ask me about meat? I think this is going to be a really interesting evolving area. The problem is getting the food industry to do these studies is really hard. I mean, who are the culprits in all this? The food industry. With sugar, salt, fat. I mean, we saw what happened in the US, and unfortunately we're exporting this to the rest of the world, which is really sad. The sugar industries, there were tremendous articles that have been investigative journalism pieces about how they put more salt in food so you'll drink more sugar and get addicted to it. And targeting kids with Kool-Aids. It was the tobacco industry that was behind that. More sugar in the diet. And really we need double-blind studies of what happens when you have high doses of sugar. We need some data. I mean, I think you can probably predict it's not going to be good, but we need data. I do believe in using scientific method to study that. So, what does a good diet look like? I still think you're probably pretty safe if you do a fairly traditional Mediterranean diet, not meat too often, right? More vegetarian, the better, probably. And I don't know what the word is on dairy. We were talking about that. I don't know. There are different theories about dairy being good for you or not. What is interesting, if you look at the gut bacteria, there's studies going on. Okay, this is the other thing I didn't even talk about, the microbiome, which mediates your health. All your gut bacteria. We're just vehicles for bacteria, right? There are more bacteria in us than there are our own cells. Gut bacteria, when you study the Hadza hunter-gatherers' gut bacteria, they have no dairy. So, it's hilarious. When you go get a probiotic, it's full of dairy bacteria, like this is our healthy baseline. They have none of that. So we're still figuring out what's the right mix. We don't even know what many of the species are. What's a healthy gut microbiome look like? And it probably varies depending on where you live and what soil you're in, what animals you hunt, because you're handling them, their blood, their gut bacteria. So that's going to affect a lot. It's supposed to, we're hearing that gut bacteria is involved with everything from mental health to heart disease, so it'll be interesting.
Okay, time for one final question.
Far back, yes.
Thank you, Professor Talk. Just one question. Regarding the Mediterranean cuisine or food diet, I was thinking like normal plants cannot make food enough for everyone, population growth in this case. But then there's the sentiment of we don't want manufacturing food, they're factory foods, even though they're natural, quote unquote, there. But there's they're manufactured, not real authentic food. So what is the deal on that?
And yeah, it's nice for me to tell you to grow your own plants and vegetables here. It's hard here, isn't it? It's hard to have your own plot. And are you going to compost to make your own soil? How are you going to do that? So hopefully, the slow food movement comes here. I think your markets have more fresh produce. I'm probably not the best person to talk about efficient agrarian diets and how do you grow with that. I do know that it costs more to eat in our country, in the US and Europe, it costs more to eat fresh plants and vegetables, but some cultures are much better at this. The French have really preserved local economy, local agriculture, for example, and local foods that are locally made. Slow food, smaller farmers, the economics of that. There is a trend globally. We're seeing more of that, but how do you make sure that happens? It continues in India. How does it happen here? How does it happen all around the world? You guys need to go solve that, you students here. I mean, it's very important. And I think, you know, some cultures do eat more meat. That I want to keep that caveat there. Look at the Inuit, right? With their genes. So some of this will depend on genomics and gut bacteria, too.
Okay, let's thank
Yep. Thank you.